Hey RP Plus, Dr. James Hoffman here. Welcome back. And today I wanted to talk to you guys about a topic that I think is really interesting, really important. And that is trying to figure out some of the best evidence-based practice strategies in the areas of sport and exercise science. So Mike and I and Dr. Davis have had the chance to do seminars, I can say all around the world at this point now, which is pretty cool. But we've done a lot of seminars, we've talked to a lot of people about different methods of training, different methods of diet, different methods of recovery, all sorts of stuff. And we kind of have gotten the vibe from a lot of people, sometimes we don't really fully understand what doing real evidence-based practice in our field actually looks like. So what I want to do is kind of shed some light on what I think my opinion is on what evidence-based practice is in sport and exercise science, and kind of a systematic way for you to kind of think about some of these things as they come up. So you might be reading an article that says, hey, there's this cool, sexy new recovery method, maybe I should do it. But you're not sure. You have to think, like, how does this fit into my training equation? Or you might see another training method that comes out and you say, oh cool, prowler pushes. I've never thought about that before. I'm going to start doing sled pushes. Should I be doing that or not? So hopefully, after today, you kind of have a feel for how I kind of feel some of these things out, and I hope that helps you guide your decisions and how you implement things like recovery strategies and training methods into your plan. So first off, we have to kind of get a feel for what does it mean to do evidence-based practice in sport and exercise science. To me, what that means is we have a number of different resources available that we're actually blending together. It's sort of a hybrid of resources. First off is the one that's the most obvious to, I think, just about everyone is. That is, what is the available science, right? What do the scientific paper, the literatures, textbooks, what do these things say on whatever topic it is that I'm trying to figure out, whether it's recovery, cold bath, something along those lines? Are there papers out there that can support or refute this particular method that I'm looking at, right? So that's kind of our go-to. That's what most people think of evidence-based, is like, what is the science or what are the kind of literature and papers say on the topic? But that's certainly not the only thing. It's definitely very useful, but it's certainly not the only thing. A couple other things we want to think about. Theory and critical thinking skills. We want to make sure that we do cover our bases on the scientific side, right? We want to make sure we know as much as we can. We might not always have all the answers, and that's something that we run into a lot in this field, where things come and go, they wax, they wane, there's trends, there's fads. We never always have the full picture, right? So we have to fall back on theory and say, what are the theoretical considerations for this particular thing? And how does it line up with what I already know on the topic, right? From there, we can use our critical thinking skills to start establishing some potential pros, maybe some potential cons for that particular method, and then we can start brainstorming ways that it might be useful or might be implemented into a training program. Now, that also might include times that it might not be beneficial to be used at all, right? That's part of the critical thinking process. There's usually something good to discuss, usually something bad, and then maybe some different means of implementation, right? So that's another part of it, using the theory and then thinking critically about the theory. Another part of it is actually doing our own data collection, and this is something that you've probably heard me rant about in testing and monitoring discussions, but it's very important. We can't just rely on a lack of scientific paper and only just using theory and critical thinking. We want to make sure that we're actually looking at what's actually happening in the field. Can I use this with myself or with my athletes, and can I actually get some data on this? Does it show that there's an effect? Maybe there's no effect at all, or maybe there's a negative effect, right? There's no way of knowing some of these things unless you go and try it, right? Especially when there's a lack of scientific evidence for some of those things, which happens all the time right now. So for example, right, one of the hot topics in the recovery world right now is cupping, right? People say, like, should I be doing cupping? All these like famous athletes are doing cupping. I see all these cool Instagram and Facebook pictures on cupping, right? Well, there's not really much science on cupping, right? There's a few theoretical considerations that we can make, but should we just base our opinion solely on that? No. Go talk to some people who have used it, right? See what they have said, what they have reported. See if your athletes are doing it, right? Or maybe even use it on your own athletes and get some feedback from them, right? It's worth collecting your own data and having some self-validation throughout this process. And that is kind of a central part of evidence-based practice, taking what we know from science, the theory behind it, thinking critically, and then actually going out in the field and testing it for ourselves and seeing if it actually works. Very important. And then last, and I would argue maybe on the least side, not totally least, but I would say probably, experience and anecdote. Experience and anecdote can be extremely powerful, can be extremely useful when we do not have other available resources. However, experience and anecdote should not be the go-to gold standard when we're trying to make these decisions. For example, there's plenty of really dumb stuff that goes on in the field from top level athletes. We're talking about guys in the NFL, the NBA, world champions, Olympians. You see them doing dumb stuff all the time. Does that mean that just because somebody else is using it, that you should be using it too? There's anecdote there? Absolutely not. Very often, they might just be successful in spite of doing dumb stuff anyway, right? They were born to be that person, and that's perfectly okay. So we don't necessarily want to rely solely on experience and anecdote. However, it can be extremely useful supplementally where you can draw back on past experiences and things that people have done to try and help guide your decision, right? So there's kind of that 4-tier there that I like to think of. What does the available science say? What is the theory behind what is going on and whatever I'm looking at? Can I think critically about it? Can I collect some data of my own? And then do I have any experience or is there any anecdotal evidence for its use in the field, right? If we can start blending all of those things together, we're on our way to doing a really good job of true evidence-based practice in the field. For a while, and I'm glad this has kind of died down, if on social media, some of you might have noticed for a little while, there was this weird battle going on between people who thought that scientists basically had no place in working in the field of sport and exercise science. Sure, whatever. It was kind of like a scientist versus coaches battle. And luckily that has kind of subsided. And what's really interesting is we can kind of split the difference in these ideas between the two groups. So you have some people who might be pure scientists. They have almost no field experience in exercise and sport related tasks, right? They might not even train. They might not have done sport, but they're just passionate about it and they do lab research, right? Well, they probably have quite a bit of available science and quite a bit of theory and critical thinking skills, but they might not have a whole lot of field data collection and anecdote and experience to fall back on. Whereas other people who have been in the business for a long time, but maybe don't have a formal education in the sense of having maybe a bachelor's degree or a master's degree or even a doctorate degree like yours truly, right? They might have a lot of data that they've collected over the years on their athletes and a lot of experience, but they might not understand the theory of how it works, or they might not just have the scientific resources available to them. So I think the best practitioners, whether you're a sports scientist, a coach, strength coach, personal trainer, what have you, are going to be the people who can take all of those things and use all of that information to start guiding you through this process of deciding what are the best diet, nutrition, training, and recovery methods that you should be implementing in your program. So really what we're trying to figure out with evidence-based practice is how we should be determining if any given method of these things should be included into our program. So the way I like to think about it is kind of starting to break down all of these different little subcategories into kind of a systematic process. So if we start first, usually our go-to place, number one first, is the scientific research. What does the scientific research say on the topic? This is also a really good opportunity for you to brush up on the basics on the topic because most scientific papers do a pretty reasonable job of summarizing all of the major points that you need to know about the topic, especially if it's in a literature review article, which gives you a huge introduction to the topic. But almost all individual papers have, about a page and a half, maybe upwards of 2 pages on introduction. So it's a really good opportunity for you to refresh or brush up on any of the information that you need to know about that topic before you move forward. Now, a lot of people use the scientific papers to get a quick yes or no answer, right? Is this right? Is this wrong? Does this work? Does it not work? And to some degree, it can do that, but you have to be very careful because one of the problems that you run into when you're reading scientific papers, often the abstracts can be misleading, especially if you don't have access to the full paper, right? So sometimes just reading the abstract is doing yourself a massive disservice because a lot of the insights from the paper might be in the discussion and in the conclusions of the actual paper, right? But one of the problems that we can run into a lot is actually getting a false positive as a result of getting bad context, especially, and this is something we see in the recovery literature all the time, where it's like cold bath, ice bath. Is there an effect? Yes. Well, therefore it must be good, right? Well, maybe, but are there other bigger considerations? Is that something somewhat of a false positive, right? Where we're saying, like, does it reduce inflammation? Yes, it does. But does that come at a cost to you? Ooh, well, we got to think about that a little bit, right? One of the other problems is we kind of have problems of omission or lack of evidence for certain things. Sport and exercise sciences are guilty of this. We often don't publish papers that have no effect or even negative effects, right? And that information is equally valuable to a positive effect, and that is just kind of a publication bias. So some people will say like, oh, there's no papers on this or that. And that can be true, but that doesn't mean that it hasn't been investigated. So that's a problem that we run into as well with some of the papers. Now, when you're starting to look at the scientific evidence, the first place that we generally recommend, and I'm sure you've heard Dr. Mike rant on this more than a few times, the first place you generally want to go to are literature, comprehensive literature reviews on the topic and or meta-analyses. Again, they have a huge introduction, gives you a really good brush up on all the things you need to know about the topic. And the nice thing is that it consolidates all of the literature for you and will kind of tit for tat look at all the results and start to compile what are the major trends on that topic. So it's a great place to start. Meta-analysis is the same idea, just a little bit more mathy, and they usually use more effect size measurements. So really good place to start to see, is there an effect for whatever it is that you're looking at. Now, when you're reading through some of these papers, one of the problems that I think people get into the habit of is saying like, is there an effect here, right? They're just looking at the end game. When you're looking through science, what you really want to start to establish are what are some of the mechanisms of action for whatever it is that you're looking at. So if it's a recovery method, right? How does this actually promote recovery? In what way does it actually work? So it's not always a question of like, can I validate this method using science or not validate it, right? Or refute it? Really what I'm trying to figure out is, does this particular thing that I'm looking at have an effect, a measurable effect on the physiology that we can see, right? Is there some variables that I can measure that seem to have an effect? And can we kind of either know or guesstimate a mechanism of action from this particular study that was looked at? So I think a lot of people glaze over that, right? And they just go to the end. They look at the abstract and they said, all right, cool, cryo chamber or sled push, right? Was there an effect? Yes, it must work, right? Well, that's not enough. We need to know how does it work? What are the things it acts on to actually be effective? So don't get caught up in the end of like the validation of the yes or no. Start looking at the mechanisms of action. See what things are actually important. It is important to also note sometimes there are many confounders, right? Like training age, if certain variables were controlled, like diet ones in particular, like if they're self-reporting their nutritional strategies, like that can be problematic. So there's always some major limitations that you want to be aware of. One thing that you should be checking out are the effect sizes. So if they list an effect size, which is usually a measurement to show how powerful any of the statistical differences are. So you can look, they usually list things like Cohen's d and more than a few other ones. And those can be really useful because one of the problems you run into as well is you'll read a paper and it says, hey, we did this sled push or this, recovery thing. And there was a statistically significant difference, right? And you might think, oh, that's cool, great, it was different. That's a positive result. But then you actually look at the effect size and it was marginal. It was not that good at best. And you might actually make an argument for yourself that says, okay, there was a really small effect here. Can I actually use and allocate my time to something else? Maybe that has a bigger effect, like, for example, relaxation, right? So that is a very powerful argument you can make as well. And then one last thing I would encourage you to think about when looking at the scientific papers is, what are the effects on the underlying physiology and what are the effects on psychology, right? One of the problems that we run into is a lot of the things that do have an effect sometimes are just purely physical, sometimes purely psychological, and sometimes either one of those can yield a performance or very close to a performance-related effect. So one of the things you want to ask yourself is the effect here physical? And can I measure what the physical effects are? Is the effect psychological? Is it a combination of the two? And does it actually have a meaningful outcome effect on performance, right? Which is, for sports scientists, what we're most concerned about. So those are kind of the big ones when we're looking at scientific papers, in my humble opinion, right? Things that I like to look for. Next, we move on to kind of theory and critical thinking. So the theory basically is we're trying to establish what we know and what we don't know on the topic. Hopefully those things are also measurable things, right? Because from our previous discussion in the science, we wanted to know the mechanisms of action. In the theoretical discussion, we know kind of a vague idea of the mechanisms of action, and we have something that we're looking at, right? A training method, a recovery method, a nutritional method, and we're trying to figure out, is there a place for this? Does this act on the underlying mechanisms of action to get the outcome that I want? That's what we have to figure out. So first, is there a potential for this to even work in the first place? If it's totally outside of the ballpark, you can usually just throw it out the window. And a lot of the cases, your investigation basically ends there, where you say, well, this doesn't even act on the mechanisms in question, so this is out, right? More often than not, it's kind of a maybe, a little push and a little pull. So the next thing we want to start figuring out are some fundamental questions that kind of seek to answer the validity of whatever it is that you're looking at. So if we're talking about, for example, physique training, right? One of the fundamental questions of something that you're talking about is this something that will help me gain or retain muscle mass, right? So one of the questions we get a lot of times is like, how much cardio should I do for bodybuilding? And we usually say no, and then people go, yeah, okay, but how much cardio? And we're like, well, really not very much, right? We say, what are the things that we need to be successful in bodybuilding physique style training? Well, I need to be either gaining muscle or retaining muscle when I'm in hypocaloric conditions. Does this do any of those things for me? You can make a very, very strong fundamental validation argument there and say, okay, well, if it doesn't actually seek to do any of those things, it probably is not worth my time. Likewise in recovery, and then those of you who have heard my recovery talk, usually one of the fundamental questions we have to ask is this sexy recovery modality adding fatigue, or is it taking fatigue away, right? That's what I need to know. That is the fundamental consideration of whatever it is that I'm looking at it. Does it act on the mechanisms that I know are underlying? Does it add fatigue or does it take fatigue away? If it adds fatigue, it's usually thrown out the window. Why? Because it's certainly not aiding in recovery at that point. So we want to develop some fundamental questions that will kind of help validate the process and our opinion on the matter. And then what I like to do is start to consider the potential pros and cons for using whatever method, whether it's training, nutrition, or recovery, that is in question, right? So there's usually some type of potential, we'll say potential benefit, right, that could be useful. There's usually some type of cost, right? That cost can be kind of hidden. You might have to dig around for it a little bit. Some of the costs are more obvious, right? Like time spent doing other training or time spent recovering or eating more of things like carbohydrates, which will definitely generally have a positive effect. Some of them are really obvious. Some of them are less obvious, right? So we want to start kind of making a kind of a tally, a list of like, okay, here are some potential good things that are going on with this. Here are some potential bad things that are going on with this. And once we have that, we can start developing some potential application strategies where we say, okay, I understand the mechanism of what I'm seeking, right? I know that this could potentially act on this mechanism in these ways. I know it gains this benefit, but it comes at this cost. So perhaps it could be used in this special way. Or maybe not used at all in certain times throughout the year. The example I like to give in the recovery talk is some of the recovery methods help you recover faster, but they just kind of chip away at the amount the amount of fitness and adaptation that you gained from a training session. So we might say that's neither good or bad, but it might be a strategic way of implementing those throughout the year. So during our GPP time, might be a bad idea to use some of those sexy recovery modalities. Why? Because it's chopping away at our fitness. Whereas during like a sports season, when we have competitions going on, that might be a strategically good time because it's actually enhancing recovery at a time when we're not really gaining much fitness at all. We're just trying to maintain fitness, right? Those are the types of questions and kind of practical implications that you want to start establishing for yourself. Now, once we have that, we got a big bulk of the work done. We have a lot of theory, a lot of evidence, hopefully, that we're working with at this point. The next part is the data collection part, where you actually go forth in the world and try and conquer, right? Can I use this in a way, right? It doesn't have to be super scientific. You don't have to be a doctor or a researcher. All you have to do is keep some good logs, do a reasonable job trying to control for some variables here or there, and see if you can actually get a measurable effect in the thing in question, right? So if you want to try the Normatec recovery pants, you can do something as simple as taking like a 5-question survey and saying like, did I have a reduction in perceived fatigue or DOMS or stiffness or anything like that, right? Is it really good science that's going to be published in a fancy journal? Of course not, right? But it's evidence in the field that hopefully you can use to help drive some of these questions. Now, again, we're going to go back to a previous point, and when you're making this data collection, you should be asking yourself, can I differentiate physical effects, psychological effects, and performance effects, right? Is whatever I'm looking at affecting my body, my mind, or does it have some tangible effect on my performance outcomes, or some combination of all of those things, right? So again, is it physical, psychological, and does that translate into a performance change? This can be a little bit more mathy, unfortunately, right? So at this point, we might have to look at things like percentage change, pre and post. We have to look at t-tests or maybe trend analysis, something like that. But this is kind of that central validating factor when you don't have a lot of evidence to back up whatever it is that you're trying to look at. So again, don't just take somebody's word for it. Just because you saw NBA and NHL teams using the Normatec recovery system doesn't mean that it's absolutely going to work, right? All that means is we know that people in the field are using it. How much science do we actually have? Well, there's only a handful of papers at the current time. Does the theory actually seem to match up? Well, it seems to enhance skeletal muscle blood flow, which should help increase nutrient uptake and waste product removal. So it lines up in theory, right? Now we have to go forth and see if we can make it work on our own because we don't have enough scientific evidence to validate it. And that really can help you go from there. And then last but not least, we can fall back on that experience and anecdote where you might have some experience with some of the training methods, some of the recovery methods or nutritional methods from just you being an athlete or you being a coach for a long time. And you might have found, you know what, like we do our weight cuts a certain way because this has worked for a very long time. You might not have a ton of other things that back it up, but you have a lot of experience, right? Again, we don't want to just rely solely on experience because I would say it's probably the least powerful, but it can be extremely useful in lieu of having a lot of other hard evidence. So now we can start putting all those things together and we say, okay, I had science, I had theory, I did a little bit of my own data collection, and I've used this particular method in the past, or I've seen other people using it, or maybe at the very least, I've talked to some other people using it in the field who seem to suggest that using it this way seems to be a pretty good idea. If we can start putting all of those things together, we can really start doing a good job of asking ourselves, does this particular method have a place in my training program or my nutrition or recovery systems, right? And I think that's what really good evidence-based practice in our field should include. You can't just have one or the other. So we don't want to be the pure scientist who only says papers only. If there's no papers, it's out of here, right? We don't want to be the coach guy only who says, you know what? I've been doing this for 40 years, derp-a-lerp-a-der, Coach Derp, right? That's no good either. We want to hit all of those things, and I think people who are able to make those 4 areas and bring them all together are going to be the best, most successful practitioners in the field. So go forth, think critically, and conquer. Do not rely on other people to tell you. Do not take things at face value. Do these thought experiments on your own, and you will reap the benefit later on and start thinking like a sports scientist. All right, I hope you guys thought this was useful, my little rant on evidence-based practice. RP Plus, it's been a pleasure. I will see you again next time.